I got to tell you guys, it is super wonderful to be here and to talk to you guys. It's been a hell of a year, hasn't it? So this time last year, I was wearing an N95 mask for 9 or 10 hours a day and changing PPE 20 to 30 times a day. Watching people mysteriously show up with oxygen saturations in the 70s, awake and talking to me, who an hour later were crashing. I then had to put on the ventilator, and over again found out either over the course of their ER visit, because it took hours and hours to get people upstairs at that point, or the next day speaking to my hospitalist colleagues that these people had died. I have seen more people die in the past year than I ever dreamed that I would, and it's been a terrible, terrible year. And to come here with you guys, an auditorium full of objectivists, I feel like Andy Dufresne in the Shawshank Redemption, that's crawled through this tunnel of shit and come out on the other side with my arms up in the air. It's like, it's so good just to be in the presence of you people. And I got to tell you, I am not so much a lecturer at this conference as I am an attendee. I've been at every single lecture, and I filled up my moleskin notebook with notes from it, and it's just been an absolute pleasure. What I want to talk to you guys about is more of the why than the how of exercise. And I want to try to persuade you to try to pay attention to your physiology, to the physical half of your life. Because one of the things that I like most about Ayn Rand and why I became an objectivist is she very strongly rejected the mind-body dichotomy. And she understood that all elements of our being are truly integrated and they are truly important to each other. Over the past year, through COVID, the cognitive demands of my job went off the chain. And when cognitive demand is very high, it unmasks for you the elements that contribute to your mental functioning and your psychological processing. It unmasks any vulnerabilities, and I can tell you that the physiologic capabilities, the physical capabilities that I created through physical conditioning greatly served me in terms of my cognition under stress. A lot of time, these small changes in your cognitive sharpness are not really detectable in day-to-day life because the demands are not that high. But when the demands do become high, it starts to become evident to you how important it is to be fully integrated and how your physiology contributes to your psychology, contributes to your philosophy. It really does matter. So when I came to the conference here, I noticed that we have people along the whole spectrum of age, and a lot of this talk is going to focus on longevity and having these physical capabilities across a lifetime. So for the young people that are here, I want you to keep in mind that this is important. Right now, to talk about longevity and the problems of aging might seem irrelevant to you. But I want you to understand that your life when you are 80 is going to be just important to you as it is when you are 20. It really is. The other thing I got to get you to understand is everything that you want to achieve in your life is going to take you longer than you think. Okay? And it's not because of any deficit in yourself. It's because we are hamstrung as a society in achieving our goals. It takes capital to achieve your goals. Financial capital, intellectual capital. It takes capital to do those things. And it is hard to accumulate capital in a society that is inflating your currency and taxing you at a rate that makes it extremely hard to accumulate capital. And the other thing is that everything does just take longer than you think. There are unforeseen roadblocks that are going to come along the way. So having an elevated physical capacity to support your cognition, to support your psychology, to support your philosophy over the course of a lifespan is going to become important to you. For the much older people in the audience, I hope this message, or people that feel like they have let their physiologic capacity decline to an unacceptable level, I hope this lecture will bring across to you that it's never too late. And that when you understand the science behind physical adaptation, you'll also understand that it's really actually pretty easy and the turnaround occurs fairly rapidly. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We'll make the point that skeletal muscle is highly evolved tissue that serves our most basic biologic function. It's evolved over millions of years. If you just get your physical exercise in the ballpark, it knows what to do with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Do not let the perfect be the destroyer of the good. So we talked about this last year and what it's been like. So I have two aspects to my life. I am an emergency physician. I practice in a very large health system with an emergency medicine residency and teaching hospitals and whatnot. And I see a lot of people, and emergency medicine is at its root oriented towards intervening in a way to turn things around, save lives, blah, blah, blah. Well, the other aspect of my life is I run Ultimate Exercise, which is a personal training facility. And there, I'm involved with helping people to produce these physiologic improvements that make them never have to engage the healthcare system on the other side where I exist. So how does an emergency physician become an exercise geek? Well, the answer is I was an exercise geek long before I became a physician, and being an exercise geek is why I became a physician. So when I was a teenager, I became involved in a nascent sport called BMX, or bicycle motocross. It was brand new. And I was just, for whatever reason, drawn to it. But like many things that I'm drawn to in my life, I pretty much sucked at it. So I was up in Dr. Ranji's left upper quadrant of hobbyist. And I wanted to work my way down into the quadrant that said professional. And it just so happened around that time of my life, my brother was taking a college course on weightlifting and had a weight set in our garage, because he was assigned to do it both in class and at home. And I started to just follow the little program that came with the Ted Williams weight set and did it in secret. And the next time I went and raced, I won, and by a large margin. It was the closest thing to a miracle that I experienced in my life up till that point in time. And probably since. I mean, it was really impressive, the difference that it made. And that brought me from that upper left quadrant into the lower right quadrant, and I became very good. And I was out practicing one day and saw a gentleman that was very well developed, probably in his late 50s, and I was like, dude, what are you doing? And it turned out that he had just opened a Nautilus fitness center. This is back in the 70s when Nautilus was starting to flower up. And he invited me to come over and take a look at the place. And I did, and it was amazing, and it was way too expensive for me to afford. So being the entrepreneurial little geek that I was, I bartered janitorial services for a Monday, Wednesday, Friday membership to the place. And one Saturday when I was doing my janitorial services, I was in his office, saw on his desk this little manual that said Nautilus Training Principles, Bulletin Number 2, Arthur Jones. Now, has anyone in this room ever had the experience of the reading of a book changing the course of your life? Well, this was that. This was the first book that I was actually flipping through it. The owner walked into the office. I was like, ooh, sorry. And he's like, no, take it home. I got plenty of copies. And it was the first book I ever read cover to cover in one sitting. And the most astounding thing about it was not what I was learning about exercise, but I was actually getting to hear from a person that operated not from emotion, not from mysticism, but from actual first principles. And it was awe-inspiring to me, and it literally changed the course of my life. It inspired me to become a doctor on down the line. So when I went through medical school, I selected my specialty, and I had an Air Force scholarship to get through med school, and I paid that back. When I got out, I thought, I want the best equipment for doing these kind of protocols possible. I was finally making some money. I decided I'm going to order it. I'm going to put it in my house. We had a large bonus room over the garage. But when it came time for delivery, we found out that the MedX leg press that I wanted to have and that I'd already ordered would fall through the ceiling into our kitchen, and that would not be good. So I bought some commercial space just to put the equipment in, and I rationalized to myself that, you know, if we train just a few clients and charge them, that will pay for the rent of the place, and that'll be that. Well, that took on a life of its own because it did work so well, and the business blew up, and it has been in existence ever since 1997. But when I opened that place, I thought we were going to be drawing in young athletic people, and that we were going to do all these cool experiments and have all of these, you know, extremely well-muscled athletes and discover these new things. But what I found out is when you open a personal training center that's private and professionally supervised, you attract a different population altogether. They're older people, they're deconditioned people, they're people that have never worked out and wouldn't be caught dead in a Gold's Gym. And that's why they were coming to me. But it turned out to be an interesting little surprise because I was literally astounded at what a turnaround this made for very deconditioned people, people with comorbidities, and people that were elderly. I mean, we had people come in on the four-prong walkers with the tennis balls on it, and there was a little threshold in the front door of the place, and you'd literally have to help them to get over that threshold, who within 6 weeks discarded the walker, were completely functional, going on trips, taking cruises. I mean, and when you train people and, you know, you take their arms from 14 to 16 inches and they wear a tank top and they feel proud of it, that's one thing. But when you take someone that was not able to do the activities of daily life or do anything that is life-giving or fun and give that back to them, that is profound. And I found a new calling in all of this. And that calling was to create physiologic headroom. And physiologic headroom was something that was defined by a gentleman named Arthur Devaney. Arthur Devaney is an economist from UCLA, and he's kind of in the same realm of economic theory as Nassim Taleb, the Black Swan guy. But he is also the father of the Paleolithic movement, which is basically an orientation to looking at how our genome evolved and how the modern environment might be mismatched with it and how correcting that can make it easy to optimize your physical performance. And he defined this term, and I love it, physiologic headroom, basically being the difference between the least you can do and the most you can do. And physiologic headroom is very important, and it is housed predominantly in skeletal muscle. So not long ago, I was helping my daughter study for biology, and we were going over the whole classification of the different living things. So it was King Philip came over for gold and silver, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species kind of thing. And the thing that differentiated the kingdom Animalia from the kingdom Plantae is movement. So as animals, movement is our most preserved biologic function. Without movement, we can't get food and we can't keep from becoming food. So skeletal muscle, by the notion of first principles is one of the most important tissues in our body, and it signals all the other tissues in our body in a meaningful way. So creating that physiologic headroom is important. So if you have this large difference between the least you can do and the most you can do, there's a lot of things you can do. But if we stretch that out over the course of a lifetime, what we want to see is that we keep physiologic headroom high. What we don't want to see is what is common today, which is this gradual downward decline, where the difference between the most you can do and the least you can do becomes more and more narrow. And ultimately, when the most you can do equals the least you can do, that's called dead. And we want to push that out as far as possible also. So what we're trying to derive is this area under the curve, this high physiologic headroom across the course of a lifespan. And there's nothing that says doing aggressive exercise or really paying attention to your physiology is necessarily going to lengthen your life. But I would like to know right now at age 59, if standing up here something happened and I just dropped and pine boxed right in front of all you guys, that everything I've had behind me has been of significantly high physiologic headroom, so that really in terms of quality, I've had more life than a lot of people that live to 100. But the argument is also that when you do that, you also push the curve out of your likelihood of dying. You get to remain productive longer. And this turns out to be very important, because when you look at these anthropological studies, when they look at hunter-gatherer groups, what they find is when they take an accounting of how much calories a hunter-gatherer brings in versus what he consumes, as long as that hunter-gatherer, as long as that producer is producing more than he consumes, his life expectancy continues to march outward. This is why lifetime productivity is important. The moment that he crosses that threshold where he or she is consuming more than they produce, you basically have about 18 months to live. And this is what the whole retirement and pension industry was predicated upon, because they knew that once you quit working, you weren't going to be drawing off of that for very long. So when we talk about physiologic headroom, what could that look like? Does anyone know who this guy is? Someone shout it out. Satchel Page. So Satchel Page was probably the greatest fastball pitcher in the history of baseball. He spent the majority of his baseball career in the Negro Leagues and wasn't allowed to play Major League Baseball until he became the oldest rookie ever in Major League Baseball to date, entering the major leagues at age 42. He was such a dramatically good pitcher that Ted Williams, likely the first baseball player to really become methodical about the science of hitting, said that when he threw a baseball, when it crossed the plate, it looked like it was the size of a marble. Satchel Page would literally, in baseball games, have his outfielders sit down in the grass while he struck out the opposing side. He played until he was almost my age. He played until age 58. And in his last game, he threw a no-hitter except for one double hit by Carl Yastrzemski, who was no slouch himself. So one of the things from the very beginning to the very end of his major league career that he had to deal with almost on a game-by-game basis is reporters questioning him about his age. How do you do this at your age? How much longer do you think you can keep going? Blah, blah. His age was the total focus of everything. And his answers to the reporters would be, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you was? He's also the guy that coined the phrase that said, dance like no one's watching, love like you've never been hurt, and live each day as if it's your last. It came from him. He's a really cool dude, and really something to strive for. And when we look at something like that, we take him as a freak and we take him as an outlier. But what we've been tricked into thinking in our society is that what's common is what's normal. But unfortunately, what's normal is not what's common. Okay? Does anyone know who this guy is? No, it's Clarence Bass. Clarence Bass is a guy that's been involved in resistance exercise and predominantly high-intensity exercise since the mid-'70s. I started following around 79, 80 when he won the Mr. America around age 40, I believe. But in this photo, that's on, I believe, his 75th birthday workout. And we look at that and we go, this guy must just like hit it all the time. He must be completely obsessed with doing nothing but this, no other productive activity. He has had a lifelong productive career as an attorney in Albuquerque, New Mexico. What you see there is achieved by 2 workouts a week. One is a resistance training session lasting approximately 30 minutes in that ballpark. And the other is a high-intensity interval training technique done on like one of these air bikes that, including warm up and cool down, takes a total of about 9 minutes. And that's it. The only other thing he's done is he's eliminated any and all processed foodstuffs from his diet. He doesn't count calories. He doesn't obsess over things. He just delivers what he thinks are the appropriate biological signals to our body. So that is actually what's normal for the human organism, devoid of all of the signal disruptions that have occurred. And this, and we'll demonstrate further, the signal disruptions that have resulted in non-optimal physiology in the majority of the population are largely philosophical and economic disruptions. Okay? When you think, and I'll show you that in more detail later, but the things that have so distorted our food supply are financial manipulations that created economic disruptions that have completely altered our food supply to one that disrupts our physiologic signaling to the extent that this is very hard to achieve unless you know how to unwind it. And take a close look at Clarence there. And then look at this guy. It's an identically aged Aboriginal hunter-gatherer. And look at the similarities in what their bodies look like. Absent the disruptions created by financial market manipulations that have cascaded down into our food and activity as modern humans, this and this look remarkably similar. And that says, this is what normal really should be, but it's not even close to what it is now. And it gets worse every day. So we know what's normal, but no longer common. This is where I live. This is all too common, and it's not normal. The most tragic thing about this photo that I find is I can appreciate it as an emergency physician in my day-to-day work, that the distance between the care receiver and the person delivering the care is very, very short. They're going to trade seats pretty quickly, or at least the caregiver is. And you might say, well, yeah, this is an extreme example. But I would like to propose to you that, no, it isn't. Did y'all look around the airport when you flew out here? Have you been to Walmart lately? This is what the majority of society looks like. And I'm here to tell you, after a year of COVID, the thing that caused the collapse was not the virus. What caused the collapse was a medical system completely destroyed and utterly hamstrung by 90 years of economic signal disruptions, married with a populace that was so physiologically deranged that they had an untoward vulnerability to this particular virus. People that had appropriate physical and metabolic conditioning could get this virus and not even know that they had it. People that had this sort of metabolic derangement, storing body fat because of refined carbohydrates and industrial seed oils that poison your mitochondria in a way that all you can do to protect yourself is store those polyunsaturated fats in your fat stores. Well, guess what? All of those polyunsaturated fats are precursors of inflammatory cytokines. We had a population that was just a powder keg waiting to be ignited by something like COVID-19. The virus was not the pandemic. The pandemic is the signal disruptions that we have inadvertently, but anyone that's an objectivist or understands the economy can see that we did this to ourselves. So I've kind of already answered the question, but you kind of got to ask yourself, if you look at the recent past, what in the hell happened? These are teenagers on the beach in the 1950s, and that's what teenagers look like. You say, okay, well, things were different then, kids were more active, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's a little bit more than that. The food supply was entirely different. And what was expected from them physically was entirely different. You think, okay, well, let's look a little further forward. This is from a photo documentary about teenagers on Venice Beach in the 1970s. Okay? So I don't have any pictures of teenagers on the beach today to show you, because I didn't really want to do that. I was afraid to do that. I don't want to be accused of fat shaming. But this is not what the beach looks like anymore. Okay? And two things are at play here. One is the disruption in our food supply that's caused us all to be human grain disposal mechanisms. The country has a high level of obesity and metabolic disease, not because we've become overfed, but predominantly because all of us have to have 10% ethanol in our gas tank. And why is that? When the Great Depression came along, rather than just letting markets correct themselves, I felt we had to offer subsidies. We had to keep the farmers alive by creating grain subsidies. Well, guess what? Once you do something like that, you never take it away. It always just doubles down. So you create an environment where there's massive grain surpluses. These massive grain surpluses have bled their way into our food supply, and they become more and more refined, and we are delivering carbohydrate and glucose and fructose to us at a rate that has never been seen before in the history of our evolution. And that's also resulted in the production of industrial seed oils, which we are just now finding out poison our mitochondria in a way that the only way they can defend themselves is to shuttle energy intake towards fat storage. And when you store fat, it's these industrial seed oils. It's polyunsaturated fats, which are precursors of the inflammatory cytokines, which create long-term systemic inflammation. Coupled with that, we have had a massive decline in our physical activity levels and the amount of hard work that we have to do. So skeletal muscle has been put on the back burner, and it has also become unable to compete with body fat. So going back to skeletal muscle being a very important tissue because it is the basis of us being animals, of making us get food and being able to keep from becoming food, we find that aging and the diseases of modern civilization are all related to muscle loss, to sarcopenia. And if we look at what the American Council on Aging says are the 10 biomarkers of health as we progress through our lifespan, what we find is that all 10 of those biomarkers are linked to your skeletal muscle mass and function. And when you think in first principles, that makes sense. Our skeletal muscles should dictate to every other tissue in our body how to behave, because without that as the primary biological function, then nothing else is possible. So how does skeletal muscle do this? This is something, even when I was a teenager, I always thought there is something so much more to this than what meets the eye. There's so much more to this than looking better. There's a lot more going on than that. And how does that happen? How do all the people that are running on the treadmill for 45 minutes look so bad, but the people hitting the weights look so good? Well, turns out that in the past 5 years or so, we have discovered that skeletal muscle is in fact the largest endocrine organ in our body. It secretes chemical messengers, which are the antithesis of the inflammatory cytokines, and we've termed them myokines. And they signal lots of other tissues in the body, like bone. It inhibits breakdown of bone and promotes the growth of new bony tissue. There are myokines that inhibit neoplastic cell growth, that inhibit cancers in the breast and colon, has been proven so far. It helps with energy usage and disposal, both glucose and fats. It signals brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which helps with your cognition. It works not only in an endocrine fashion, but in what's called a paracrine fashion, so the muscle secretes back on itself to inhibit chemical messengers that put a brake on its growth and its strength and unmask that, so improved performance is a possibility. It works in an autocrine fashion, in a paracrine fashion, meaning it also signals tissues close by and other muscle tissue than the muscle that's being worked. I don't know if anyone's a workout geek in this place, but you've often heard stories of people that get put on a program of heavy squats, barbell squats, and their arms grow. But if you take a subject and you have them do nothing but barbell curls and tricep press downs, but nothing else, guess whose arms grow more? The guy that did the squats, because of the paracrine function of the myokines signaling all the tissues of the body, including the muscle tissue. So that's just to get the concept across to you that skeletal muscle is going to do all sorts of good things for you. So one of the things it really does is it just basically makes you stronger, which turns out to be one of the most important things. People talk about elderly people, their balance deteriorating and having falls and getting injured. And that's often been assumed due to atrophy of the balance organ in the brain, the cerebellum or the inner ear, functioning declining. But the truth of the matter is, this is really just too damn weak. Because if you watch an old person that's frail walking, they'll do this really stiff, small step kind of thing. It's because they're trying to maintain a bone-on-bone tower to support their weight. The moment you break the 180-degree lockout in the joint, the muscles have to bear that load. That's why if you're walking through the grocery store and there's a frail elderly person and you accidentally bump into them, they don't have enough power to correct that and they'll fall to the ground, and that's a big deal. So, a couple years ago, we had a journal club in emergency medicine. We invited Rick Miller, who is the chief of trauma at Vanderbilt University, to come talk to us, and he talked to us about this. And it used to be that being a trauma surgeon was like being a fighter pilot. It was like the coolest thing you could do. It was knife and gun club. It was very dramatic. You generally took care of healthy people that were really, really messed up, but could recover and walk out of the hospital. Now, every trauma service at every major teaching institution in the country, the majority of their beds are occupied not by knife and gun club, not by car accidents, but by elderly ground level falls. So you have a frail elderly person, bump into them, they fall, they land on their right side. So now we got a humeral neck fracture, we got 6 broken ribs, we got a pneumothorax, and we got a femoral neck fracture, maybe a small liver lac. You get admitted on the trauma service. Well, what Dr. Miller started to figure out was the person's functioning pre-injury determined their prognosis. Okay. And they started to investigate their functioning pre-fall, and they found that if prior to the injuries, grandma could get up out of a chair on her own power, there's an 85-90% chance that they were going to be discharged home. If grandma could get out of the chair but had to do it in a stepwise fashion where you're rocking and you're pushing up on the handles and doing all sorts of maneuver, but could still get out of the chair, 50% odds you're going home. If grandma can't get up out of the chair without someone to assist her, grandma was not going home. And now they develop more sophisticated screening tools to determine what your prognosis is. And if your pre-injury functioning is too low, the next step is to call in hospice and withdraw care. The stakes are really high for old people. And the good news is it turns around quickly. So when we talk about physiologic headroom, this is a graph created by Joseph Signorelli, a friend of mine that is a researcher down at University of Miami, and he's just showing the different curves. The solid black line is physiologic headroom across the lifetime. With lifelong training, the dotted line at the top, you can see how much better that looks. But if you start training someone around age 50, you get this bent aging curve that approximates the lifelong training curve. And I can tell you from my experience at Ultimate Exercise, if you do it well, that actually trends up towards the lifelong training curve. You can really skip up there. Another researcher, Dr. Padden-Jones at Texas State University, created this third red line, the Padden-Jones line. And that's how it really goes, because once you start to go off the rails in terms of your physiologic headroom, you'll have an event. You'll get a pneumonia, you'll have an injury, a little car wreck. And then that knocks you down a huge notch. And then you claw your way back up again, but never back to baseline, and you start another descent. And then something else happens, and that just goes that way until it can't be recovered. And those little dips there, that's also where I live in the emergency department. Okay? It is a revolving door. If we zoom in on that red line, what we'll find is a whole bunch of little squiggly spikes that cycle every 48 hours to 2 weeks. It's a revolving. I see them over and over and over again. Half the patients that I see and admit to the hospital were discharged 48 hours prior. It's not the way to go. So it really is a matter of use it or lose it. So this is an MRI of the thighs of someone. So if I'm laying with feet towards you and you slice me up like a honey baked ham and you look at slices, that's what we're doing. The top is a 40-year-old triathlete. The middle is a sedentary 74-year-old male, and the bottom is a 70-year-old triathlete. And the thing to notice is the one in the middle is how much adipose tissue has outcompeted the skeletal muscle in that context. And that person is going to be so weak and frail they might even be bedridden. And it's like, okay, so you've demonstrated that the lifetime activity is important. Great. Well, look at this. This is a 92-year-old male. On the left is where we began, and on the right is 12 weeks of resistance training. The change in functional capacity is going from bedridden to independent living in 12 weeks. And having reviewed the actual protocol that was used to train this person, I can tell you that kind of improvement in my shop is abysmal. But even something done not that well produces dramatic results. So that's the message that, like, even if you think you're not doing it right, it does not matter. Your skeletal muscle is smart. Please get started with it. You can even see the bright white in the center, that's the femur bone, how much denser that becomes. And bone density is near and dear to my heart because the strength training protocol I use actually came out of a research project on osteoporosis to slow the movement down so it'd be safe for women with frail bones. What we found out was slowing it down created more aggressive muscular loading, deeper fatigue, and better results. And that ended up bearing out in not elderly and not frail people. And we used to think that in order to build bone density, you had to have this mechanical loading of the bone. There had to be forces present to make this remodeling take place. And what we've come to find out is that reductions in strength precede losses in bone and vice versa. Increases in strength signal gains in bone. And what we're finding out is that the myokine signaling, not the mechanical loading, not the force imposed on the bone, is what's causing the improvement. The muscle is signaling the bone, we need you to be thicker. So no longer do you have to risk injury in order to have improvements in your bone density. So body composition, it's more than just calories in and calories out. It's about sending the right biological signals to your body. And myokines, released from the working skeletal muscle, shift the home field advantage towards lean functional tissue. I used to think that all the tissues of our body cooperated with each other for our benefit. But all those different tissues have the same DNA, but they're all methylated differently, so they express different tissues. These tissues in our body exist in competition with one another. If you disrupt the signals to the body such that one tissue gets a competitive advantage over the others, guess what? All nutrient input gets shuttled towards that preferentially, and that's how fat gains the competitive advantage in our body. So if we just change the signaling through proper physical activity and avoidance of industrialized processed foodstuffs, then things automatically trend towards an ideal body composition. Also, this type of activity balances the major energy signaling pathways in our body, mTOR, which signals nutrient abundance, and AMPK, which signals nutrient deficit and the opportunity for cell turnover and repair. By doing something of high energetic output, you have a momentary spike in mTOR that's very, very high. And everyone's like, ooh, that's bad, because mTOR shortens life, blah, blah. It's like, no, you gotta ask yourself, what is the level of expression, and is it acute or chronic? So this acute spike in mTOR creates a situation where those receptors get downregulated and an AMPK gets expressed more in appropriate balance. So once you have achieved that appropriate balance, you've also created an energy signaling pathway that's more optimal. We also optimize blood lipids, and I'm going to blow through some of this kind of quickly. Going and getting your cholesterol tested to me just seems like a marketing strategy to sell statins. Okay? Think of your cholesterol as like police cars. And systemic inflammation is the crime. Okay? Police cars carry out policemen to the scene of the crime to deal with the crime. Your lipoproteins carry cholesterol out to the site of inflammation to patch it, so the wall of your blood vessel doesn't activate a clotting cascade and give you a stroke or heart attack. It's actually protective. So to lower your cholesterol is kind of like saying, okay, we're not going to let cop cars go into the poor area of town anymore. Cop cars can't go into the hood where the drug dealers are. It's the same sort of logic. What resistance exercise does and proper diet does is it actually deals with the upstream underlying cause, which is systemic inflammation. And reversing that automatically makes your lipid profile look better. But you got to remember what's downstream and what's upstream. Hemodynamics, it also helps your cardiac functioning, because your coronary artery blood flow is very much determined by the venous return on the right side of your heart, gets pumped out the left side of your heart, gets shot out your aorta, and during diastole, during the relaxation phase, that blood backwashes and hits the opening of your coronary arteries. The blood that's in your heart doesn't nourish your heart muscle. It pumps blood out and it washes through coronary arteries that lie on the surface of your heart and that supply your heart muscle. Strength training, by virtue of the muscles contracting, milking venous return, augments that process in a way that's very cardioprotective. Also, you get decreased systemic vascular resistance because myokines signal the production of more and more blood vessels, which increases the surface area for your blood to get distributed to, which lowers your blood pressure over time. And blood glucose control is a major biggie, because the skeletal muscle is the largest glucose reservoir in your whole body. You store about 200 grams of glycogen in your skeletal muscle. You'll store about 50 or 70 in your liver. What's in your liver is to maintain a stable blood glucose for your brain. What's in your skeletal muscle is for on-site usage. What happens when you do hard work is you release adrenaline. Adrenaline comes into the skeletal muscle, and there's a cascade of enzymes that cleave glycogen into glucose molecules for usage inside the cell for energy. And that happens by an amplification cascade. So glycogen's like a tinker toy, and you're going to knock off little pieces of glycogen. Adrenaline hits one of those enzymes, and we'll call it A. And enzyme A then hits 10,000 enzyme Bs. And each enzyme B, each one hits 10,000 enzyme C, which then activate the cleavage of glycogen. So small amounts of adrenaline output during hard exercise cleave massive amounts of glycogen, emptying the biggest glucose reservoir in your body. And that lowers your need for insulin. It increases your insulin sensitivity, and it basically invokes the antithesis of the metabolic syndrome that's created by the signal disruptions that we talked about earlier. It also improves your aerobic capacity, but not by what the world has termed cardio. It actually stimulates the aerobic subsegment of metabolism by using intensity to take glucose, drive it to its end product, and force it through the mitochondria as fast as it can use that end product. And by doing that, you maximize the aerobic subsegment of metabolism, but also you can currently maximize all the other elements of metabolism outside of what occurs in the mitochondria. So people don't know this, the mitochondria, the little single-celled powerhouses that are inside our cells, were actually ancient protobacteria. So we have these single-celled organisms that took glucose and metabolized it through 20 steps to create some energy, and the waste product was pyruvate. That got spilled out. These little protobacteria ate it. But these little protobacteria had way more surface area because they had all these foldings on the inside of them, so they could concentrate energy more powerfully. Well, the single-celled organisms ended up taking up these bacteria into their interior, like viruses infecting our body, but it turned out to be a symbiotic relationship. So ever since then, we've had these little protobacteria inside of our body helping us to generate energy to build bigger and more complex bodies. This is cool, gene expression. So in the early 2000s, Simon Malov from San Diego, from the Buck Institute on Aging, did a research study. And he used a statistical technique called a false discovery rate to determine genes that were expressed differently in the aged versus the young. And then subjected aged subjects to 26 weeks of strength training and found that the gene expression in these elderly subjects reverted all the way back to the same gene expression of a 25-year-old based on the methylation pattern and its functioning for what it encoded for. So for the first time in human history, we have always been fascinated with life extension from the Epic of Gilgamesh on forward. First time in human history, documented reversal of aging in a human subject. I thought this was going to blow up. I mean, resveratrol showed a 15% life extension in worms, and it flew off the shelves. This did not. It's still been crickets. And it's because it requires a couple of simple things. It requires effort and discipline, and people don't want that. There's also the epigenetics of it, the methylation of your DNA. So anyone that's ever experienced training and then quitting for 6 or 10 weeks and then coming back to training, how quickly it all comes back. It's because the DNA sites within the skeletal muscle are methylated, so there's memory for coming back. So if you're well conditioned, you get in an auto accident or you get sepsis and you end up in the ICU, not only are you more likely to survive, but when you do survive and come out, you're going to be much better off for it. And finally, brain factors. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor is a myokine. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, but through some second messenger mechanism, it raises BDNF in the brain and preserves cognitive capacity. And also the decline in BDNF is an independent marker for mortality. It's just bad to have. So all of this is taking place in the context of we are now encountering technology that may be able to extend our lifespan. The young people in this room can probably expect to live to age 150. provided that the regulatory burden of the FDA doesn't make it impossible. I'm hoping for it to come to fruition in my lifetime, but I'm not very hopeful of it, mostly because of the regulatory burden and the philosophical deficits in our society about life and what it means. And the modern paradox about this possibility is that in Western countries, for the past 5 to 10 years, on a year-by-year basis, expected lifespan has been declining. It's getting worse, not better. So we have this very difficult paradox to deal with. But what we do know is that resistance exercise addresses all 10 biomarkers of health and aging, and it increases the physiologic headroom and the area under the curve over the course of a lifespan. And it's the only technology thus far, besides David Sinclair's work, which is still restricted to animals predominantly, that has shown documented reversal of aging at the molecular level in humans. And I believe it's the bridge for the technological advances to come. These advances will come. You got to be healthy enough, wealthy enough, and live long enough to avail yourselves of them. But I think it is going to be available. How are we doing on time?
10 minutes.
I'm sorry?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. I think I may have gotten a little ahead of myself, but real quickly, this has been about the why. The how, I would encourage you to go to the workshop that's being held by Chad Morris. He can show you the how of doing this. And it's really quite simple, and it can be done with little to no equipment. With a pair of yoga straps and a yoga block or a foam roller, you can get a static workout delivered to you that is amazing. For standard gym equipment, just to get started, just very basic movements. Those 5 movements, or those 3 movements even, can cover all the musculature of your body. And rather than doing an infinite myriad of specialized movements for particular muscle groups, you can go down that pathway later when you get deeper into this. But what we find is that intensity over complexity is what really makes the difference. So as you do hard work, if you are continuously loaded, you aggressively recruit segments of your muscle in an orderly fashion until they get fatigued very deeply. And that deep fatigue is the stimulus that makes the adaptation occur. So that fatigue drives the recruitment of everything in the kinetic chain that's doing that movement. So in the beginning, you can really just focus on some very basic, easy to do movements and put all your concentration on doing it with high effort. And this continuous load and fatigue necessitates a brief workout. If you do this right, you won't be able to stand much more than 12 to 15 minutes. And done properly, you got to remember, if we're going to synthesize these adaptations de novo, if we're going to add a pound of muscle to our body, think about a pound of ground beef in the grocery store. Your body's got to synthesize that de novo. Well, guess what? It takes a little time. So by definition, the frequency of exercising has to be relatively infrequent. Twice a week, as you get better, even once a week is enough, because you need the time for adaptation. It's actually a necessity. So it works out in terms of the time efficiency. And you can look at my book, but there are others that I would recommend. So my co-author, John Little, has a new book out called The Time Savers Workout, and it brings other protocols into play that you can try. If you find yourself going more down the aesthetic bodybuilding pathway, high intensity training by Mike Mincer is a good starting point, but there are multiple different programs that take resistance exercise to focus on the aesthetic muscle hypertrophy aspects of it. I know the gentleman standing next to Eric Daniels there follows Renaissance Periodization, which is a great program that focuses on muscle hypertrophy and appearance and strength performance, other than just all of the things that we talked about. If you have no equipment whatsoever, on the bottom left is Project Kratos by my friend Andy Bay. That's BAYE.com. You can order that online as an ebook. It shows you how to do meaningful resistance exercise with no equipment whatsoever. And finally, the joint-friendly fitness on the upper right-hand quarter is if you're going into a commercial gym, there are ways to set up the equipment so you don't put yourself in vulnerable positions so that you do not get injured. And I highly recommend that, because one of the things that drives me crazy is there's been a big movement toward the primitive in exercise training, thinking that if we just mimic movements in nature and, lifting stones and awkward things, and it just drives me crazy that what's considered the state of art in exercise right now is flipping a tractor tire and beating it with a sledgehammer. It does do something. It will get you conditioned, but it will also get you hurt, and that is not the goal. And I would highly encourage you to avoid that paradigm. But at this juncture, it's been a massive, massive honor to be here in front of you people, and just to be in your presence as an attendee, not so much as a lecturer. I just am very humbled to be in this room. Always remember that each and every one of you and your philosophy makes a difference in the world, okay? Remember, Beowulf was written hundreds and hundreds of years after Aristotle. It was an incredibly primitive and mystical world that occurred hundreds of years. Societies can collapse, but the people in this room can bring it back. And I'm just very indebted to you people and your philosophy, and I love you for it. And I thank you for paying attention to me.
Questions? Great talk. So your great pitch about the benefits of strength exercise, and
I'm gonna stand where I can see a little better.
yeah. So the thing is, in order to provide an adequate stimulus for your body to adapt and grow, it requires a type of stimulus that is going to bring a big amount of discomfort. And we live in a modern world where it's almost as if they're trying to make us as comfortable as possible. We're living in a room, perfectly air conditioned, sitting in our comfortable chairs. So a lot of people aren't, they're not used to dealing with that type of discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to see what things do you think people could incorporate into their lives to better adapt them mentally to maybe not only tolerate discomfort, but to maybe embrace it.
Okay. If I could encourage everyone in this room, and particularly young people, have a strong, strong bias towards action. So what I find is that the discomfort of exercise is actually a governor. And it's a governor to protect ourselves from hurting ourselves, and it's built in. That governor has a slide bar on it, almost like a rheostat. And once you get started, that tolerance of exertional discomfort, every time you do it, goes up and it gets better. So any level of exertion that stresses skeletal muscle at all is meaningful and will produce adaptive responses. As you start, the intensity will not be very high and the tolerance of discomfort will not be very high, but if you just get started, it improves exponentially. It auto-corrects, and you don't really have to worry about trying to inculcate it in a top-down fashion. It tends to happen organically and spontaneously as you just get going. So I tell people in my facility, when the exertional discomfort builds, and in some movements it's extreme, I tell them, once they've learned that it's not going to cause them to injure themselves, to focus on that discomfort, focus on that pain, and deliberately try to make it worse. And when you do that, it's like running up on a mirage in the desert. It just fades away. So if whatever the locus of that governor is, if you focus on it and try to provoke it, it tends to back off and leave you alone.
Thanks.
Yep. There's my Renaissance periodization, man.
Yeah,
hey.
thanks for the shout out.
Yeah.
So
I love Drew. He's an awesome, very learned guy.
I have a tangentially related question, actually. I'm wondering if you could comment on how to cultivate a more intrinsic enjoyment of exercise where you actually want to do it rather than regarding it as kind of an instrumental value where you're kind of compelling yourself to go and exercise. Because I'm definitely kind of in that middle ground, right?
Right. So the answer to your question is kind of the same as the answer to the first guy's question, is it does build organically and spontaneously over time, not only because your toleration of the negative effects, the dysphoric feeling of the discomfort and the exertion, become less dreadful to you, but also you see the dramatic benefits on the opposite side that come to you as a result of it, and it's got a very positive feed-forward type of aspect to it. As you become more advanced, you're able to inflict more and more punishment on yourself, so that gets to be more and more of a challenge. And also, as you become more advanced, your improvements become more asymptotic and start to level off. So now you're faced with, I can really, really hurt myself for very marginal improvements. But then the memory of what it was like before drives you to keep going. And the very important thing that we learned at our facility is that you can't just say, okay, I've gotten good enough and I want to maintain. Because we got people really far along and we decided, okay, we're going to use this weight and we want you to hit a minute 30 seconds before you hit failure, and we're just going to hold it there. So you just go to a minute 30, we'll be good. Without exception, every single client retrogressed and got worse. Unless you were striving, and I think this is true in life, unless you are striving for continuous uninterrupted improvement, you will backslide. And unfortunately, I think that's the only good answer to your question, but there it is. And
So
you're living
basically-
embodiment
So basically
of
you
it.
have to white knuckle it until...
Pretty much, yeah.
All right.
It's true for everything, though.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Maybe you just nailed my problem. I've always exercised, and psychologically I feel 19 years old. I love it.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep it. And I recently went to my doctor and got the diagnosis of osteoporosis, which of my lower spine. And that blew me away. And he said, but you're very frail. You need Prolia. And I got the shot. I got it. So the image of being frail, just psychologically, I would, go to exercise and I said, oh, you're frail. You might break something. And I dance and I do a lot.
Yeah.
So I just
Yeah,
your
this is a major
advice
pet
on
peeve for me.
Prolia.
Yeah, ignore that. Got it.
And
To
I'm
me-
a psychologist.
To me,
right?
the bone scan, the DEXA scan, is a marketing tool to sell bisphosphonates to patients.
So should I not take Prolia anymore? I mean, you can't diagnose.
I cannot offer you
I know
medical
you
advice.
can't.
I'll go to hell and lose my
Right.
license and blah, blah, blah. But here's what I can say,
Yeah.
is that when you look at the research study that were done on Japanese women who expressed the worst osteoporosis, the thinnest bones in critical areas like the lumbar spine and the femoral hip, when you look at the ones that have been strength trained, what we've come to learn, it's not so much the density of the bone, but the strength of the surrounding supporting musculature.
Okay. That makes
A
sense.
vertebral body devoid of its surrounding supporting musculature will crumble under 10 newtons of force, just like this bottle will. So it's much more important the quality of the surrounding supporting musculature than the actual density of the bone as measured by a DEXA scan,
Yeah.
which if you happen to do it 5 times on the same day, the precision of the instrument, so the accuracy is good. If you take 10 measurements and average them, you'll get an accurate read. But those 10 measurements will be all over the map.
Wow.
So if you did it 5 times in the same day, you would get a different reading each time, and 3 of them would be bad and 2 of them would be excellent.
So I'm
And that-
not frail.
Do you feel frail? I would say no.
Okay.
Just exercise. Make sure you're strong.
Yeah.
If you're strong, you can tolerate almost an infinite degree of bone thinning without a bad outcome. And taking these bisphosphonates, the thing you got to remember about a drug is the greater its therapeutic effect, the greater are its side effects.
Oh yeah.
So when you hear the Claritin commercial that says side effects similar to placebo, that by definition means that the therapeutic effect is similar to placebo also. The more powerful the therapeutic effect, the more side effects you're going to have. That's just part and parcel. So in exchange for thickening some bone in your femoral neck and your lumbar spine, you're going to lose bone in your mandible and your teeth are going to fall out. There are trade-offs for
Yes.
everything, and that's a bad one.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's a
so
1,
much.
like 1 minute. All right, that's fast.
I'll try, but thank you. This
You're
talk
welcome.
was absolutely lovely, and I loved that you gave some good, like, basic workouts and good ideas for just things that can hit all aspects of the body. That was going to be one of my questions, but the other one is if you have any basic, like, safe foods or food groups or ideas for diets and what to eat, because I am an athlete, so I eat a whole lot, and I'm also
Yeah.
a college student, so I don't have a whole lot of money.
Okay,
And so,
let's make it super, super simple.
or yeah, give me a book if you want to dodge the question entirely.
I won't dodge the
just
question
good
entirely.
advice.
Later you can approach me for some books and I'll give you some references. But rather, I would like you to use a heuristic. Okay? All energy that's in our body comes from the sun. So number one, get out in the sun. Convert vitamin D3 and a myriad of other nutrients that are expressed in sunlight that we have yet to discover yet. That sun acts on plants and phytoplankton, who as autotrophs make their own energy. You can eat those, and your body knows what to do with it. There are some animals that eat those plants. You can eat those. And there are some animals that ate the animals that ate the plants, and you can eat those. And as you go up the food chain, the nutrient density concentrates better and better. So meat from a good source is going to have very high concentration of nutrients. Phytoplankton or basic, salad is going to have a lot of hormetic chemical stressors that are beneficial for your body, but the nutrient density is going to be less. But the common theme is a straight line between you and the sun. When something deviates off that line via processing, the signal gets disrupted and your body doesn't know what to do with it. When there's massive signal disruption in your body, any dysphoria at all gets misinterpreted as hunger. If you're thirsty, you're hungry. If you're upset, you're hungry. If you're bored, you're hungry, fill in the blank. But for an athlete, I would eat ad lib, whatever you want. Just make certain that you're eating a whole food natural diet that stays on a straight line between you and the sun. Your body will know what to do with it, particularly if you're active as an athlete.
Cool. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you, guys.